morning, everyone. My name is Maureen Scallon-Failer, and I am president of the Bloomington Chamber of Commerce, an affiliate of the Minneapolis Regional Chamber. Thank you so much for coming out this morning. Great group this morning, Eric. Lots of great people here in the audience. We're going to do this kind of informally, as the congressman likes to have a fair amount of time for question and answers. So I'm going to be bringing up the congressman here shortly. This is a series of programs that our Public Affairs Committee puts on, so I would just like to recognize our members of the Public Affairs Committee of the Bloomington Chamber. Can you gentlemen, and can you please stand just so we can recognize you? All right. John, Orv, and Wayne, thank you so much, and the group does good work, and I appreciate you being here this morning. Well, we are here to hear from Erik Paulsen, Congressman Paulsen, this morning. You have just been elected to your 4th term? Wow. Wow. Well, and I'm proud to say that, Congressman Paulsen, I am a constituent and I live in your district, and I would like to thank you for all your years of service. The one thing that I want to just make sure you all, and I know you all know this, but Congressman Paulsen is really one that tries to do the next right thing to make our state a better place to live, work, and play. And that's kind of been your philosophy down in Washington consistently for the 4 terms that you have been serving down in Washington. So thank you so much on behalf of the business community and my family. And because of the work you do, we do have a wonderful community. So let's give them a round of applause. I'm not going to get into all your committees, but you play a very important part on the Ways and Means Committee, and I know there's lots of interest as it relates to what's going on with the budget down in Washington, so I know you'll be talking about that as well. We've got a great group. We've got small business, medium business, large business here in the room. We have our educational folks here from Metropolitan State to our school district to Normandale. Lots of interest here this morning to hear from you. So without further ado, please come up, Congressman Paulsen.
Thank you. Well, first of all, good morning, and thanks for letting me come to the chamber. I have to commend Maureen on her leadership, and Bloomington is an active chamber, and that's why your activity, I think, is what really makes our community strong and makes Minnesota, or this area, such a great place to live, work, play, raise a family, which I certainly believe, and I know many of you do, in keeping the chamber active and involved. And just thanks for being a part of that. Thanks for all of you for being. It's great to be here. Companies like Toro and the superintendents, schools are here, of course, and the city council members. Tim and Andrew are here, and I know Mayor Winstead was going to try and make it, but I don't think he was able to make it. But we all keep our community strong by staying intertwined and working together constantly on issues that matter. And so for me, being on the Ways and Means Committee is really an opportunity not to be in some powerful Washington committee in D.C., but really to have a voice in Minnesota's economy, and making sure we're focused on a couple of issues or a couple of opportunities to do better. And I'll open up with this, because Ways and Means Committee, it's basically taxes, it's trade, it's health care. It's a lot of what is a big part of our economy. You think of the healthcare players we have here. It's good to see some folks. I want to talk a little bit about some positive news in healthcare development recently, actually just a little bit. But I thought I'd start out with just giving an update on is this whole concept, what I talked to the chamber about before. And this is really important to the small business community, medium businesses, large companies, and that's tax reform. And we spent the last couple of years on the Ways and Means Committee laying this strong foundation for comprehensive tax reform, knowing that's the direction to go when the tax code has not kept pace with a modern economy, right? And now you have issues like these inversions that come up with Medtronic, of course, locally recently, and others that look to, unfortunately, have opportunities to connect with companies overseas or move companies or operations overseas rather than growing them here in Minnesota. And it's all a result of the tax code, really. And we got to make sure we allow the earnings to get back home to the United States, because a lot of our companies now, I think of Toro and others that are active in the trade world in terms of selling where the customers are. 95% of the world's customers live outside the United States. If you want to keep the headquarters here, you want to keep the innovation here, you want to keep those jobs in Minnesota, United States, you've got to get the earnings back home. And we have a tax code that is very uncompetitive vis-a-vis our trading partners, in the sense that we tax our earnings twice. And a lot of other countries don't do that. So just a quick example, if you're Harley Davidson and you're selling a motorcycle in Germany, you're going to pay the tax not only in Germany when you sell it, but then when you want to bring the revenue or the sales back to the United States, you pay tax also in the United States. Whereas BMW, if they're selling a motorcycle in the United States, they're just going to pay that tax once in the United States, and then they bring their earnings back home, and they keep developing the next generation of their motorcycle or their car or whatever it might be. So it's an area where we've been lagging behind, an area where there's an opportunity to provide some revenue for transportation funding and some other areas if we can actually get this fixed and doing it right. But knowing that comprehensive reform has been a little elusive over the years, because it hasn't happened since 1986, so at least a broad overhaul of the tax code, what is the next best thing that we feel in Ways and Means Committee? We have a new chairman, by the way, who's Paul Ryan, right? And he's an economist by background. He's been a really good leader, young, energetic. One of the best things we can do is just give more predictability, more confidence, and more certainty to the business community as related to the tax code. And that's really important because a lot of tax provisions expire every year or every other year, or we're in retroactive tax mode, right? And so for companies that are allocating capital or planning their budget on a 5 or a 10-year horizon, it doesn't do you much good if the tax code is expiring every year and certain provisions are expiring, and you don't know if they're going to be there again, right? You don't know if you're going to be able to invest in new equipment or invest in certain areas of your company if there's going to be an expiration. In fact, right now, we are operating under retroactivity right now because Congress renewed like 70 extenders right at the end of December. And so they only extended those extenders till December 31st. And so, you know, we looked back and did retroactive tax policy, which is what we're going to end up doing again this year unless we act to make some of these permanent. So we've taken the approach this year to at least make several of these provisions permanent, especially the ones that are tied to the economy or tied to true business or job growth. One being the Section 179 expensing, which is basically an opportunity to depreciate quicker. If you purchase, like, let's say you're a farmer, you purchase some farm equipment, or you're a small business, you purchase some expenditure or something that's important to your company, you can write it off a little sooner. And then we up the dollar amount too of what you can actually write off. So it goes from like $25,000 up to $500,000, which is actually a big deal when you're purchasing a new machine for a manufacturing company, for instance. But it's probably just most important just to have some permanency around it, because we've been renewing these year after year after year. If we just make it permanent, then you can count on it, you can depend on it, you can plan accordingly. And the research and development tax credit is another one of these credits, actually, that has been around since 1981. It's been renewed like 31 times. You'd think that we'd figure it out, right? If it's helping, if people are taking advantage of it, they're using it, why not just make it permanent? So actually this week in the House, we will be voting to make that permanent. I believe we're finally taking that up. And the Section 179 bill that I mentioned, we already took that up in February. And big bipartisan votes on these measures, by the way. And so we're looking for those opportunities for, you know, bipartisan tax reform opportunities to actually pass them in the House, pass them in the Senate. You know, the Senate's a little slower in terms of their, they have different vote margins and rules they have to take things up on. But if we can, I think, generate some momentum in the House in some of these provisions, hopefully we can get them passed into permanency. And one other I'll mention, too, that we're going to bring up this week is the estate tax. And we're actually going to move forward to repeal the estate tax. And there's a Bloomington company that I talked to, Johnstone Supply, not far from here, actually, family-owned business, passed on to the next generation. And companies like this, they not only have to plan accordingly to how they're going to work their tax law in terms of passing on to the next generation, you know, they're paying up to 20% of their dollars in life insurance, just paying for life insurance because they're not sure how to plan according to the tax code. And so it's a tremendous waste of resources, the money that could get deployed into terms of growing the actual company. And a lot of companies like Johnstone, they don't have a lot of liquidity. And so if the owner passes away, for instance, it's going to be unfortunate because it's not only an issue that affects the family business, they literally would have to sell off a part of the business just to pay the taxes. And that means all these other people are unemployed. And so it is absolutely a key provision that it should be addressed just to provide some more permanency in the code for longevity with family-owned businesses. And it's the exact same for farmers and ranchers. And the testimony that was heard in the committee was actually really powerful, and it was straightforward, and it's really common sense. And if you could tie Minnesota as a state, I know we have tax issues and they're going through the budget issues in Minnesota, but if you could have some tax conformity, you could really make Minnesota kind of restore it to be a place where you not want to just move to Florida or Texas as you get close to retirement for the weather, but make sure that it's only the weather that's attracting you out of the state, for instance, and not other issues. Maureen, you mentioned the budget. And this is actually a real important point it doesn't get a lot of attention in terms of, press coverage in terms of what Congress has been doing successfully on the budget, right? Because we got an $18 trillion national debt, and Washington has never been very good about being on a smart path to fiscal responsibility. But I will tell you this, the House, as is done 4 years in a row, has passed a budget once again that balances in 10 years. It's a big blueprint, and it's pretty broad. It doesn't get down to all the specifics, but a blueprint's important because it allows the appropriations process to move forward, so all the different committees in the different areas can actually pass their bills rather than doing these concurrent resolutions that just do funding for the year at last year's levels. And we've been doing that for a couple of years, which doesn't allow you to prioritize very well, quite honestly. And so we passed a budget. The Senate actually passed a budget for the first time in many years as well. In fact, it hasn't been done in both houses since, I think, 2009 or 2010. And if you remember, that was the time when the health care law passed. The new health care law, which is a whole other issue. But the reason that they did that to pass the budget, both bodies at that time, which was controlled by Democrats, now it's both happen to be controlled by Republicans, but it allows in the Senate to do some different rules in terms of how you move tax legislation forward, how you move health care legislation forward, because you only need a 50-vote margin to pass something that's tied to those bills, those types of bills, in the Senate rather than 60 votes. And that's how the health care law passed, with 51 votes. And so we're looking to make sure that we agree, at least reconcile between the House and the Senate what a budget should look like for a blueprint. And it will allow us, I would argue, to offer some more positive solutions or opportunities around health care, move some of these tax initiatives forward to the president's desk, hopefully to get some support to get some of those signed into law. And it makes the legislative process a little bit smoother or a little bit easier. So it can be inside baseball a little bit, this reconciliation process. But in the grand scheme of things, it's just really important for actually accomplishing some meaningful things and actually communicating, I think, some positive solutions. Because I will just tell you, as a Republican, I get a little tired of having to say, well, we voted no on Obamacare, right, for the 50th time. We'd be much smarter if we actually laid out what our vision is for a better healthcare system, more consumer choice, doctor-patient relationship, chronic care management, management of costs, for instance, value over volume, rewarding that type of competition, and better coordinated care that some of our care providers actually in Minnesota do a pretty good job with that haven't been implemented at the federal level. And so there's an opportunity there for sure. You mentioned I mentioned transportation, and I only say this from the part of tax reform could get fed into the transportation funding stream a little. There's an opportunity here. And it's important not only because transportation obviously is a big deal in terms of having a long-term plan, right, that focuses on development of roads, bridges, transit, et cetera, that we're all a part of, and Bloomington certainly is aware of that. But we've been operating also under this short-term funding stream, right? And so we've been renewing with general fund expenditures and other little almost gimmicks, but they're short-term. It's short-term planning. It's not long-term 6-year authorizations, which we used to have. And in fact, we haven't had a 6-year authorization since they got rid of the ban. They have the ban on earmarks now. And so they found out when you don't have earmarks for projects, right, in different districts, it's a lot tougher to pass a transportation bill to get a large mass of members voting for it, right? And so it's a different sort of psychology that's been going on actually around transportation. And so in May, just this May, we will have an expiration of the current funding stream because the Highway Trust Fund has been slowly getting depleted, and the money's got to go back in there somehow, right? And so if it's not going to be, a gas tax, which no one is talking about or supporting, the president doesn't want it, members of Congress aren't supporting it. What's going to be the transportation funding scheme? Is it going to be a 1-year patch again with general revenue funds? Is it going to be something else? Well, remember I mentioned earlier this international tax, repatriation of earnings, getting earnings back to the United States. There's been a little bit of talk about whether this might be a possibility. There's actually serious discussion about this. And if it happens in terms of getting $2 trillion of overseas earnings that are trapped overseas back to the United States, getting some of that tax paid on that, but then having some of the revenue here, there's been talk about actually having some of that money channeled into transportation. And some of us would be okay with that as long as it's not just a one-time deal or another short-term gimmick, but it's actually part of a larger comprehensive reform package for the tax system, again, for all the reasons I talked about earlier, which would really be helpful. And so there's actually some real talk about this bipartisanly that actually could happen. I was a part of the Ways and Means tax reform package, the big draft that was laid out last fall. The president had it as a part of his budget that he introduced this year or offered this year, although he dialed up the percentage of tax that companies would pay. So in other words, there's some discussion about what that level should be, how much earnings would actually come back to the United States, and what the dollar amount that would go into the transportation system would be. I personally would favor more expansion of energy development and using those royalties and dedicating to transportation or long-term projects. That's not been done. And so there's a little give and take, I know, between the administration and what Congress would like to do on energy development, for instance. But there's an opportunity, and Tim Walz, who's our congressman to the South, and I have worked on that in the past, and I think we're going to continue to talk about that to see if we can generate some support and some enthusiasm for that. And then I'll just hit one more issue real quick, open it up for questions, Maureen, if that's okay, and that's trade. And this is another one of those bipartisan opportunities where I think we're going to see some success, and I'm optimistic about it. And it's something that's very important to Minnesota. I know it could be important to a company like Toro. It could be important to a lot of small and medium-sized businesses in Minnesota where we have supply chains that are so tied to different areas of the economy. And in the medical device community, which is really strong, obviously, in Minnesota. I've been, passionate about that industry, about repealing the device tax and streamlining the FDA reform process. But now our trade agreements, for the first time, are actually diving in and actually detailing in greater detail how we can actually help the medical device industry as a part of these trade agreements. And it's really important that we are setting the rules for other countries to follow around trade. And that's important because China is kind of going in the other direction. They don't respect the rule of law, intellectual property in a lot of different areas. And it's really important that we protect that type of ingenuity and know-how as a part of our trade rules and negotiations. And this is important because the trade negotiations today are more 21st century trade agreements where we're talking not about just quotas and tariffs, but it's these behind the border measures that actually needlessly slow down the movement or trade facilitation and movement of goods and services. And it's a real opportunity to actually increase dial up a little bit the economic dial with increased productivity if we can actually streamline regulations. So what does that mean? Essentially, with Asia, it's emerging markets. It's making sure that we get a foothold in the Asian area where it's going to continue to be the center of economic activity for future growth. Serving as a counterweight to China in the region, for instance. Again, 95% of the world's customers live outside the United States. 80% of the world's purchasing power is outside of the United States. So if we can sell where the customers are, we will continue to do very well. And trade is actually supporting about 775,000 jobs in Minnesota in one way or another, which is a big number. And so it's one of the reasons why our unemployment level is actually lower than a lot of states, because we've been tied into this for a long period of time, again, at all levels of the economy, small, medium, and large companies. But the opportunity for enhanced trade is really helpful for small and medium companies here because the large companies have the compliance officers and the lawyers and the teams that kind of deal with some of these regulations. But if we can actually streamline a lot of these certifications, regulations, testing procedures, et cetera, we can actually help small and medium companies access and sell American, which is really, again, a huge opportunity. And then the other area of not just Asia, but it's the EU, it's Europe. And these are our best friends, our best allies. People say, well, don't we already, spend a lot of time with them right now? And the answer is yes, because we share a lot of the same values. But it is important to point out, transatlantic trade between the EU and the United States is huge. It's 50% of the world's GDP. It's 30% of the world's trade already going on. So even if you move the quotas or tariffs a little bit, it has a huge impact economically. But again, more importantly, it's about these other behind the border measures, because Europe does the certifications for how they have automobile or transportation safety equipment very different than we do in the United States. So if we can set up a system where we have common agreement on the regulatory scheme or how regulations are done, we can actually have a system where, say, your medical devices are approved in the United States by the FDA, and you wanted to have the same process in Europe, you have the same similar language, you could have oversight committees in both bodies, essentially streamline it so you get devices approved quicker in one economy or the other, as long as there's agreement. And so it's a huge opportunity that I don't think we want to miss. And when we get back this next week, when we go back to Washington, we're going to move forward, both the House and the Senate bipartisanly, to pass this trade promotion authority. And all that is saying, look, Mr. President, is the administration is negotiating these agreements, and they're already almost finished with the Pacific negotiations. They're starting on the EU negotiations over the last 4 months, and now that's going to accelerate, is we've got to put some guidelines about what we should be negotiating, what is important to us as members of Congress, for instance. And then you follow our guidelines, and then we have an up or down vote on these trade agreements. So we won't be amending them, we won't be changing them, and that just makes sure that our trading partners know they're dealing in good faith. They put their last and their best final offers on the table because they know that it's the real deal, right? It's going to be an up or down vote, and Congress isn't going to be like nitpicking and picking things out and changing it after they put their offer on the table. So I think we're going to see that move forward in the next couple of months, or next couple of weeks when we get back. Both House and Senate, the President supports it. It's bipartisanly going to move forward. Probably later this fall, the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal will hopefully conclude, and then the EU trade agreement is just farther out. It's probably still going to take another year to year and a half, just because we're not as far along. But if we can generate the momentum on a few of these other trade initiatives, I think we're going to see some progress and opportunity. So with that, I kind of rambled a little bit, but that's just a little bit of background about a couple of key issues. Just, you know, in the end, it's just about trying to get some things done. And you know, being in Washington, it's a very frustrating environment. And, you know, Bill Frenzel, who is just an outstanding member of Congress for so many years, who represented this area, and then continued to serve in other ways after he left Congress. He was a great mentor to me. Meeting every 3 months, we'd get together, Jack knows this, and we'd have coffee and talk about trade and tax, because that was near and dear to his heart. But you know, folks like him are missed because they understood the value and the importance of cooperation, working together, getting things done, and I want to continue to follow in that mold. It is sorely needed. It's the way we see progress. And one glimmer of hope, I will just tell you, is that right before we left for the Easter Passover break, we had this annual, again, it's all the short-term fixes, but this was in healthcare, and it's this doc fix that comes up year after year, right? And it's this patch that comes up, and everyone knows it's not good for our seniors or our physicians when you have a 20% cut that comes up every year, and as Congress comes in and they patch it for 1 year, and everyone knows it's one of Washington's biggest accounting gimmicks. Well, right before Easter, a big bipartisan vote to fix it permanently in the House. So you had Speaker Boehner and you had Nancy Pelosi come together, kind of push the left and the right, and kind of the folks that were kind of, you know, saying don't do this, and pushed it aside and said let's just do a permanent solution. And it was tough to get there, but it was a big 392 vote margin. And I think the Senate now is going to be put in a position where they're basically going to have to take this up in the next couple of weeks. And that's a milestone, because if you can get this short-term patch off the table on the doc fix every year after year, I've been doing it for like 17 times over 15 years, you can actually do other healthcare policy, right? And then actually have started talking about those debates and opportunities. And so it helps our seniors with a little bit more reform with wellness and prevention. It helps doctors certainly with quality measures. So they're kind of looking at how their quality measures should be treated themselves rather than Washington determining what quality is. And also looks at reform of how other providers are paid for better coordinated care model. So it's going in the direction more of real health care rather than sick care, right? Which is actually smart in terms of where we need to go for our health care policy. But thanks for having me here. Thanks for what you do with the Chamber, most importantly, and our education system. You know, Normandale College, Bloomington schools, which I love going to. I was just at Normandale Hills, I think, recently. And so I love going and visiting our classrooms and being with Chamber members. And it's really listening and learning that I'm able to actually act and respond on your behalf.
Great.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to have some Q&A for about the next 20 minutes. We'll wrap up at about 9:15, 9:20, because I know the Congressman likes a chance to be able to visit with all of you. So I do have a message to pass on to you. Our Chair-elect Robert Freeman with Health
Robert.
Partners,
Right,
yes.
right.
He wanted to make sure that I extend his gratitude and thanks on behalf of Health Partners and all the other health providers here in the metro area on the fixed doc.
The doc fix, yeah, right.
Yes, yes. So thank you very
Good.
much. He wanted to make sure. He's in Disney World right now.
Okay, that's better. That's good.
Legislature, Disney World.
Yeah. Right after we passed that, he left for Disney World. Okay.
So why don't we open for Q&A? John.
You talked about tax reform.
Yeah.
The state tax in particular, if you had to handicap the Senate, and it's one thing for you guys to come together in a bipartisan way, but we still have to deal with the Senate.
Right.
How would you handicap that?
Yeah, so, well, a couple of things. Number one, we've passed several of these tax measures with pretty strong bipartisan votes in the House already. The Senate has not taken any of them up yet. And so part of that is, again, sort of a different culture process in the Senate. They've been slower to sort of take some of these initiatives up. And, I'm a little worried where we've passed 40 to 50 bills already with bipartisan votes, human trafficking and other issues actually that are really important that I've been working on, for instance, Senator Klobuchar, and they haven't had any action in the Senate. And so they are slower. And so it makes it more challenging. There's no doubt about it. Now, the estate tax, which you referenced, we'll vote on that. It should have bipartisan support, I believe, going forward. And again, the testimony was very powerful. The problem is that, it somehow becomes an easy issue to demagogue. At least some of the Democrats have used that. I can see some senators doing that, for instance, saying, look, why should he be helping the Paris Hiltons and other folks, et cetera? And that's not what this issue is about. This is about helping family-owned businesses pass on to the next generation, for instance, and so they don't have to sell off their assets and hurt others as a part of the economy. And I'm not as optimistic, but in terms of what the Senate action might be, but I will say that because Congress bipartisanly, House and Senate, every year does these extenders anyway, they always do them. It happens year after year after year, big bipartisan vote. We just wait till December to do it. If we could get a couple of these passed on permanency, there's no reason not to do it now if we're going to do it in December, right? And so if we could do like one or two, I think it will generate momentum on a couple other tax initiatives. Our other challenge, quite honestly, has been with the president because he's moved in his budgets from no tax reform to some business tax reform to more business neutral or revenue neutral tax reform. And so we've been pushing, and Paul Ryan, as I mentioned earlier, is the new chairman. He's been having weekly conversations with Jack Lew. So we are not closing the door or the conversation at all to anything in the tax arena. That's very important. As the presidential cycle, there's more candidates announcing today, kind of kicks off, I worry that it slows down the process as well, though, unfortunately, which probably picks up probably more in August and September, to be honest. So we're trying to get as much as we can done before that time frame.
And Eric, along that same vein, what's your handicap on the Senate passing the patch? Because they still haven't.
Yeah, on the doc fix. Yeah, I would handicap it as a very high percentage that they'll have to act on it. And I know that, and here's the reason why. It's not often you get an issue like this where you get Speaker Boehner and then Pelosi together on this. And, at first there was some, again, folks on the left and the right, they're saying, well, we can't allow this to happen. We got Republicans, we got to wait till we control everything, in 2 years. And Democrats not wanting some provisions because there's some real entitlement reform in here in Medicare, actually, which is really important. It's good for taxpayers for the next 10, 20 years. And so that all came together. And it puts huge pressure on the Senate because we've gone past the deadline for the doc reimbursements right now, which was the end of March, right? And so when we get back, I think they see the vote in the House and they say, well, we're not going to pass a short-term deal when we know the long-term solution's already in front of us. And so I'd say it's 90%. So I think it's a pretty high percentage they're going to take it up. And the Children's Health Insurance Program, by the way, which was reauthorized as a part of this deal, I support it anyway. But that's a part of the whole deal that kind of brought all sides together on this, which is really important. Yeah, please.
When we talk about children, I think one of the things we've seen here in Minnesota on our Native American reservations, school facilities that are not only inadequate, but they really constitute for many of us a moral outrage. And what's such a drop in the bucket in terms of what that's going to take, something to set that off in the first place. It needs a solution.
Yeah. It really needs a solution. The issue you mentioned are these schools up north. Is Leech Lake, I believe, is the one that's been really atrocious in terms of the school conditions. In fact, this is something the Minnesota delegation, as a congressional delegation, has really come together on. In fact, we just did a letter recently, and John Klein is the head of the Education Committee. He was up there, actually, recently with Rick Nolan, right, the Democrat who represents that area. And just looking at what we can do to actually address the issue, it is more resources. So there's some of it is at the state level, state legislature. I know there's some issues being debated. But in Congress, what we're trying to do is make sure that our appropriators are going to put more resources into there because there's no children in that situation that should not be afforded the ability to have a good learning environment. And I think that's our obligation. The Star Tribune's done a really good job about highlighting some of these deficiencies. I would just expect our delegation as a group is going to be really forceful or pushing as hard as we can with our, the appropriators to prioritize this internally. So we're paying attention to it now over the last couple of years, actually, thanks to the exposure that the Star Tribune and others have done on it. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
You have so many things on your plate. This is kind of a little bit out there, but I know water management has been kind of at the state issue, or at the state level for a long time. And about 10 years ago, I was visiting family in Norway, and I actually had an opportunity to go to the Nobel Peace Museum, and surprisingly, a lot of their focus on peace and stability in the world had to do with fresh water. And outside of Africa, they pointed to the United States as one of the most vulnerable areas for peace related to fresh water and the growing need for water management, that being fresh water not generally available in the southern states and most of the fresh water being in the northern states. And they actually pointed to Minnesota as being one of the most vulnerable states because of our proximity to the Great Lakes and the fact that we have so much fresh water here. Yeah. And now here, about 10 years later, when you hear about California and the droughts there, is there any federal policy being looked at in terms of our country's water management systems and how we might be dealing with that, with or without climate change, just the fact that we're dealing with huge water disparity?
Yeah, there hasn't been enough focus on it, and it's a little bit outside of my area of expertise just because the committees tend to focus more attention to it. I know the California drought issue has had some attention in Washington. Part of the drought, of course, is related just to the environmental issues, and some of it, in some newspapers, or the Wall Street Journal even wrote, I think, a piece this weekend about the California drought situation, because they've been diverting a lot of water to the Bay Area, fresh water, that is no longer going into the Central Valley. And this is where like 90-some% of our fruits and vegetables, and now you've got this fallowed land that is not being used at all, and it's affecting food prices, and it's going to continue to get worse. And so there's not enough urgency around it, to be honest. And some countries, I think, are ahead of the game in terms of focusing on, they're smaller countries, so they probably just have the ability to focus on what, like a state like Minnesota, for instance, has done on its own, right? And so, in fact, I was in Arizona recently. Water's a big deal. I mean, the utility companies oversee water there, much like electricity here, for instance, because you order water when you need it, and it's a different process. But those, I think, issues are going to be exacerbated, in 10, 20 years. And so it's a planning issue, really. And I'm not as familiar with it, so if you ever have ideas or thoughts that should be shared to get ahead of the game a little bit, I'm open ears on it. Yeah.
Erik, I know you've been a strong advocate and a leader in the human sex trafficking arena, and I know we have Meg Schneibel here from Cornerstone. I'm a former board member, Meg. Is there any updates or things? I know you were a chief author on the safe harbor laws.
Right.
Any updates in that area?
Well, this is one of those, in fact, Cornerstone is great because, they're so active. And Bloomington was like, the original location, right, for all the great work. And now the expansion that's gone around the Minnesota Twin Cities area has just been outstanding. And this is one of those issues, again, it just hits home when you have the ability to really, truly save lives. Again, young girls, right? 12, 13, 14-year-olds, young boys, others that have been trapped in this environment. Bloomington has been paying attention, with the hospitality industry around here, learning new methods of tracking it, paying attention to it, going after the bad guys. And we passed 12 different bills right away in January. And we did them quickly because we had already gone through all this work last year of really understanding and educating a lot of our House colleagues in particular about the importance of addressing this issue. Big bipartisan votes. The Senate never got to them before the end of the year. And so this safe harbor provision that you mentioned is really important so that young children that get trapped in this know that they're not going to get prosecuted for prostitution or drugs, et cetera. But you get them out of the shadows, you get them services, you treat them as victims, you make them productive in that capacity and get them back on track with their lives. And then they help turn in the bad guys, by the way, as a part of this whole process. And we passed those bills. The Senate kind of got caught up in some abortion politics now, which is just so needless. The best thing they could do, because they're kind of fighting about combining the bills and who's going to author them. The best thing they could do is just take the bills up the way the House passed them on 12 different versions. They would pass like that. I guarantee it. And that would be the best thing to do at this point. So I'm not sure. It's kind of hard to say how they're going to address it. I think internally they're trying to wrestle with moving them forward, but they're being held up for needless reasons. And it really is a meaningful way to literally save lives. And so Senator Klobuchar has been a great partner on this, by the way, and it's just one more example of how you get bipartisan, bicameral opportunities just to get some stuff done. And this is one of those things we should be able to get done. Yeah, wait a minute. Yeah.
I just want to thank you also, I'm Debbie Belfry, Bloomington Public Schools, for your attention to the Carl Perkins Federal funding, which supports career and technical education programming at both secondary and the post-secondary level. And those types of funds are helping us look at new innovative models. We have a couple programs here in Bloomington. Right here at the Chamber, we've developed with our business departments a relationship with a program called Future Leaders, where we use our business and industry partners through our relationship with the Chamber of Commerce to help students identify program areas that they may not know anything about, and we can start reaching them in as their sophomores, juniors, and seniors in high school to expose them to that, and also engage our business community with education. And our second program that is supported by those innovation dollars would be our Bloomington Career and College Academy opening in the fall. And again, helping students recognize that the need for their academic base, but providing them opportunities for their technical education as they move forward. And again, being able to develop those between secondary education, post-secondary education, and our business partners. So thank you for your attention to that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for mentioning that, because obviously there are funding provisions that are very important in the education, sector, which is critical. And so the feedback, about what is really working, continue to provide that feedback. You mentioned Carl Perkins, but it's very interesting. I went out to Bueller Company recently, and they're in Plymouth. And they make all the food manufacturing equipment. Actually, it's one of those trade companies or trade opportunities that they're Swiss-based, a lot of European investment, but they got a big headquarters, North American headquarters, right here in Minnesota. And they do like 60% of all the production of equipment that goes into manufacturing chocolate around the world, and other food processing. And what was really impressive touring that company last week was that they've established an apprentice program by working with the Wayzata school system locally to identify students that are not necessarily going to be on track to normally do, traditional college, for instance, but that might be on track with this apprenticeship program to do other technical training and skills. And it was all working with the local school district in terms of identifying the pipeline that's now going to allow these students the opportunity not only to get trained in this environment, but then go over to Switzerland and then just get a better worldview, right, of where new opportunities are. And so it's, I think, an example where, it's Normandale, it's Metro University is here today, and there's schools, public schools in Bloomington doing the exact same thing with the business community, right? And so we need to keep hearing about where those opportunities are, because this sort of a one-size-fits-all is not the approach, right? And it's very unique to district, community, state, as well as making sure STEM is important, right? In today's world, as a math major, I can say that. And so that's really important to emphasize. It really is. And then understanding where the needs are as the labor market needs to fluctuate, as the business world and the knowledge economy changes, and at the same time understanding that welders and all those other areas are so important where there's been a deficiency over the last decade or so. Yeah, good point. What else? Yeah. You get two in, yeah.
Comprehensive immigration reform.
Oh, yeah, immigration.
Affects education, it affects employment, businesses, driving, and
right.
It's a huge issue, and we just haven't seen any coming together or progress.
There hasn't been, and it's frustrating because, as someone who advocates for the need for immigration policy, the immigration system is broken. It is clearly broken. It's locking out the next generation of innovators. I will be reintroducing my legislation that says if you are educated in the United States in science, technology, engineering, math, those fields, you're trained here, you're educated here, you should get your green card. You should be on track to stay here. You should not be kicked out of the country to go back to your host country, whatever it is, where they'll start a company to compete with us. That's essentially what's happening, right? And that's just one little piece of the immigration system. Again, the comprehensive effort was tried, at least in the Senate a couple years ago, and for various reasons, it got bogged down and just dragged down and no movement. And now we're seeing we need to make adjustments also around lower skilled immigration areas where the labor force is needed, both in farming and in landscape nurseries, for instance, right? That's very, very important. And so, again, my preference would be show you can make progress, because there is bipartisan support in both of those areas, and you can actually build the opportunity for some larger reform. Republicans, quite honestly, in the House, some of my colleagues have been very resistant to some of those changes that I think are very, very important. I've been frustrated because even the border security issue, which is a big issue for the country and especially for a lot of our border states, there was a package that came forward in February, and we have not acted on it yet because there's some in my conference that say, well, we shouldn't take any action until after the next presidential election. That makes no sense to me at all, because again, the best legal immigration system you're going to have is one that recognizes the ebb and flow of the labor market, and where you know who's coming in the country. And then, you're not going to round up 11 million people and kick them out of the country, for instance. And so whether it's legal status or something else to help these folks, making sure that they're part of our economy, that's the direction to go. And that's the conversation that should be had. But it has not had a lot of attention right now. Yeah, Tim.
Thanks for being here. I appreciate that you're here this morning. You mentioned tax reform, but one part that you didn't mention was online sales tax reform. And obviously it's a big issue, and it's an issue for Minnesota companies, for Target and Best Buy. That people go to Best Buy, spec out a TV, and then while standing there, go on their mobile and order it online without paying sales tax. I know that the online biggies like Amazon and some others support it, and I'm just wondering why we can't get this done and put this to rest.
Yeah, late last year, there were 30 of us that sat down at a meeting with the Speaker to talk about the importance of addressing this online sales tax issue, because the tax code or Washington should not be determining what the winners and losers are based, right? If you're going to be making a purchase, it shouldn't matter if it's in a bricks and mortar store or if it's online, right? If it's a purchase, it should be evenly taxed in the same manner. And so we emphasize the importance, because this is actually a Judiciary Committee issue, and it's a states' rights issue, more than like a Ways and Means or tax issue. So that's where it's been kind of hung up. So we had the Judiciary Chairman come in as a part of that meeting, who's been a little resistant to embracing what Target and Best Buy and some of those companies have been good about, stakeholder groups have been good about saying, here's the problem, this is our legislative solution. He's been resistant to that, and he has some valid points too. But I think there's easy room for the right compromise or the right bill to get done. It's making sure that small businesses are going to have some sort of exemption level of not being caught up in sort of excessive online sales tax reporting, whatever it might be that a state might use to go back and grab small businesses retroactively. You got to make sure that's not going to be allowed, right? And I think you can do that in the manner that along with having the same software, generic software that allows a company to collect the tax, right? And then, by the way, this is tax that is you're required to pay under law, right? People just aren't doing it, right? So you just have to have sort of Congress figure out what the final answer is to making sure that it's enforced, essentially, is what this is. So the Speaker kind of gave the Judiciary Committee sort of a gentle warning, like, we will be dealing with this issue, and if it's not going to be in Judiciary Committee, it might be the Government Oversight Committee, for instance, that might be looking at it. And so that was sort of a prod to get moving on the issue. But quite honestly, the Judiciary Committee Chairman has been bogged down now with patent reform, which is very important, some of these immigration issues that I mentioned. And so we got to keep this on the forefront. It's been hung up. There are some, it's been caught up in political reasons too, or for political purposes, because some argue, well, it's a tax increase, so they don't want to have any sign that, oh, well, they're voting to increase taxes. But again, you're already required to pay this tax. It's not a tax increase. I mean, it's not.
One more question, Mr. Carlson.
Thank you.
Happy birthday, Jack.
I think of all the congressional districts in the United States, the 3rd congressional district has probably been the best represented. I can go back to McGregor and Frenzel and Ramstead, and now Congressman Paulsen, who fits right into that great tradition, is doing a wonderful job for us. So on behalf of all of us, Eric, we thank you so much for following that great tradition in the 3rd district.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, it's great to represent a great community. And I actually think the best way, and I learned this from Ramstead and certainly from Bill Frenzel, but the best way you can represent your community or be most effective is to just travel the district often, visit small businesses, tour companies, visit the schools. I've had 186 school visits, right? And we've got great higher education institutions. I mean, it all comes together. And you mentioned earlier about, great place to live, work, play, raise a family. And so it's just being able to most effectively represent you is just about listening and actually getting your feedback on a regular basis. And so I'm just fortunate to have a district that is very globally aware, that is highly educated, that is paying attention, and understands elections kind of come and go. But in the end, you just got to be results-oriented and solution-oriented and just move the ball forward on some of these issues. So thank you very much. Thanks for being here with this one. Yeah, thanks, man.
Thank you
All right.
so much. Thank you all for coming out this morning. And again, Congressman Paulsen, thank you for all the work you do. You are wonderful, how you reach across the, the aisle. You're there to do the next right thing, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks.
Everyone, have a great day. You can stay around for a few minutes.
Oh, yeah,
and
absolutely.
Great.
Sounds good.
Thank
All
you,
right.
everyone.
All right.
Have a great day.